Firewatch is one of those indie games that will forever hold a place in the genre. It has defined nearly a decade of walking sims, and continues to receive both high praise and a lot of criticism. For all of its apparent faults, however, Firewatch harbors a deeply sobering story, hidden behind a veil of paranoia. Seemingly a psychological thriller filled with government conspiracies, the game is, really, just about how we process trauma. Firewatch begins with a few selections the player can choose between, each slightly impacting dialogue later in the story. You are Henry, out on the town with his friends when he approaches a woman at the bar. This woman, Julia, quickly becomes more than a stranger, and within the week, Henry and Julia are dating. The two date for years, moving in with each other, marrying, and from there Firewatch has you select a few options. At first inconsequential, they gradually increase in severity. You adopt a dog together, you drink beer on the porch together, you argue together, you get robbed together, all the while something seems to be getting worse. Julia forgets your dog's name, she begins to break down, and eventually you find out why. Julia has developed early onset dementia. You're given choices on how to handle Julia's condition, but ultimately, it doesn't matter. All of them lead to the same destination. Whether by sending Julia to a facility or keeping her at home, Henry becomes distant with his wife, her memory decaying. Julia, again, becomes a stranger. Depending on player choice, Henry either recognizes how serious Julia's condition is, or mistreats her. She is either separated from Henry, receiving the care she needs, or kept close to him, becoming worse by the day. When Julia's family takes her back home, regardless of your choices, Henry is left far from his wife, either a way avoidant of the truth. This is where Firewatch first introduces trauma and abuse, and how they go hand in hand. Henry, despite seeing firsthand the terror inflicted upon Julia, tries his best to avoid the reality of her dementia. Either by sending her away, or acting as if she needs no help, Henry is always in denial, hoping to bury the truth. With Julia in Australia, Henry has the chance to make things right and visit her, but, instead, goes even further in his isolation. He takes a fire-watching job in the Shoshone, fleeing as far as he can from his problems. Henry goes deep into the forest to escape, isolating himself from any and all reminders of Julia and what he did wrong. His neglect for Julia's condition turns into neglect for himself, in which he self-isolates and disappears. This isolation is a key theme in Firewatch's narrative. The trauma Henry witnessed his wife go through, and the trauma he incidentally inflicted upon her, drives Henry away, deep into the mountains. This self-isolation, and Julia's condition, acts as the backdrop to the main story, the motivator behind why Henry is in that watchtower. But Julia is also hidden in every word, every tree, every crevice. Going forward, Firewatch's isolation is made that much more unnerving with the memory of Julia. In his 1844 essay, The Concept of Anxiety, Soren Kierkegaard offers up the image of a man standing upon a cliff. He faces out to the wide landscape before him, and the terrifying drop beneath him. Sudden dread overcomes the man, paralyzing him. Simultaneously, the man is terrified of falling, but also entranced by the thought. Kierkegaard calls this the dizziness of freedom, something ever-present throughout our lives. When we are faced with choices, with difficult decisions, we have that dizziness swirling within us, even if we don't notice it. Kierkegaard argued that without this anxiety, we would essentially be unconscious, going about our day without reflection on the choices we make. It is this anxiety in his view that allows us to both make mistakes and prosper. It is simply a matter of choice. Several years after publishing The Concept of Anxiety, Kierkegaard published his book, The Sickness Unto Death, in 1849. Being a Christian existentialist, he focuses much of his essay on God and man's relation to it, but central to the book's message is the concept of the self, and how one loses it. The despair that comes from freedom constricts people, denying them their true self. Connecting it to Kierkegaard's previous essay, this despair arises from when one looks out from the cliff and cannot make a decision, fearing both outcomes. In this sense, they are refusing to be authentic, leading them away from what Kierkegaard saw most important, the will of God. Later existentialists like Martin Heidegger would delve further into the concept of authenticity, rejecting the religious aspects of existentialism for an atheist approach. However, at its most basic, Kierkegaard's notion of the authentic self is one above anxiety, one who is able to embrace freedom without the despair of awareness. In the vast wilderness, Henry is confronted by the truth of his actions. Metaphorically, Henry is looking out upon the cliff with the anxiety of what he should do weighing over him. He can either turn back, go into solitude, and pretend to forget about Julia, or jump off the cliff, plunging headfirst. Henry is stuck here, unable to commit to either. His inauthenticity leads him into isolation, and it's in this isolation that he's confronted by the truth. The game truly begins when Henry arrives at his watchtower. After climbing to the top, he's contacted by his boss, Delilah, who sits in another tower across the valley. Though never physically present, Delilah is the only other person Henry truly interacts with throughout the game. She acts almost like an anchor for Henry, tethering him down so as to not shut him off completely. She first tasks him with stopping some teens from setting off illegal fireworks, afterwards arriving back at the tower to find it wrecked, presumably by the teen girls. This begins the quiet yet ever-lingering paranoia of Firewatch, gradually growing as the game progresses. After finding the teens' abandoned camp the next day, Henry is informed by Delilah that the teens have been reported missing. The last person to see them was Henry. Depending on player choice, Henry can either tell Delilah to report them missing, or hide the fact that they ever saw them. No matter what though, Delilah keeps the encounter with the girls hidden, just so she doesn't lose her job. This is where Firewatch begins exploring Delilah's dynamic with Henry and her responsibility. While not initially explained, she reveals later on she had taken this job out of heartbreak many years ago. Up here, away for the summer, she's able to sit back and decompress, isolating so much that the rules of society outside need not apply. She's simply up in her tower, free to be herself. She's terrified of losing that position, and will fight to keep it, even if it means a lack of regard for safety. However, it comes with a catch. Throughout the game, Delilah shows that, just like Henry, she makes mistakes. She's flawed up here, only exacerbated by the isolation she endures alone. Now with Henry, however, the two begin to feed into each other's anxiety. Not only are the duo filled with fear, but they too are filled with what Jean-Paul Sartre would call bad faith. Defined in his 1943 book, Being in Nothingness, Sartre describes bad faith as a concept or action that one holds in order to deceive themselves, usually in the face of something they fear. It could take the form of a simple lie to yourself, or maybe the belief in a non-existent God to justify your actions. Though Sartre was inspired by Kierkegaard's ideas regarding authenticity and how they connect to faith, Sartre rejects God, and therefore the need for it to be authentic. Instead, Sartre argues that, while comforting, the faith in something uncertain, or perhaps an outright lie, is, well, bad. Acting in this bad faith, Henry closes himself off, maybe even hiding the truth from Delilah if the player so chooses. Delilah, too, lies, hoping to push away the responsibility of facing the truth. Early on in the game, she tells Henry about the former Firewatch who had worked at the tower before him, Ned. Ned had brought his son Brian with him that summer, something that is extremely prohibited. However, Delilah simply let it happen, even vouching for Ned when he was almost caught. This lack of responsibility feeds into Henry who, just like Delilah, became complacent in the face of danger. As despair leads into inauthenticity, so too does bad faith. Here developed is the origin of bad faith, the possibility which consciousness possesses of wavering back and forth, demanding the privileges of freedom by pretending to be concealed and confined in an already established ego. In the Shoshone, Henry is confined, escaping the freedom he so desires because of a shattered worldview. Sartre would argue that Henry is avoidant of the truth, hiding behind the veil of bad faith to protect a fragile ego. In this isolation, he and Delilah leave behind reason, giving way to the anxieties Kierkegaard warned of, and the paranoia that comes with solitude. The consequences of this isolation begin to rear their ugly heads when Henry finds out that someone is spying on him. Not just him, but his conversations over the radio with Delilah. Almost immediately after, he's knocked unconscious by whoever is watching them, and he and Delilah both are sent into a panic. What Henry thought was an escape quickly turns, yet again, into a nightmare. Henry and Delilah convince themselves that whatever's going on, whoever's orchestrating this theorized spying operation, is on the other side of a fence Henry had found earlier. Henry prepares to break through the fence, locating a fire axe. Before he is able to, he breaks down over the radio to Delilah, panicking, convinced he is going insane. He rests for the night while Delilah replaces their walkie-talkies to avoid the interference, and now both of them are in the thick of it, truly believing that someone, something, is watching their every move. Sartre's bad faith delusions have taken center stage by this point in the story. The fear of the outside world and the fear of Henry's isolation being broken compound along with Delilah's insecurities. Firewatch urges the player to truly believe that something is happening in the forest. It's what makes this game so unnerving on a first playthrough, and the reason so many are disappointed by its ending. With a forest fire raging to the south, Henry heads north to break into the gated meadow, finding a radio tower and some documents spread throughout a tent, each describing in detail the personalities of Henry and Delilah. Now the in-game characters and the player are convinced that they are involved in some sort of conspiracy. Before leaving the research camp, the two consider burning the place down, but decide against it, knowing the fire it would cause would be massive. Upon leaving the meadow, Henry turns around to see the camp in smoke. He rushes back to his watchtower and discovers a cassette taped to his door, a recording of Henry and Delilah. Someone has set them up to make it look like they lit the fire. Only hours later, the fire at the research station grows exponentially, connecting to the previous forest fire. Set to decimate much of the forest, an evacuation order is issued for the watchtowers in the area. Henry, terrified of returning home, determined to prove his innocence, marches out to find something, anything to help his case. In the firestorm, Henry finds a makeshift fort built by Ned's son Brian a few summers prior. When he informs Delilah, she's surprised to hear about it. Ned and Brian had fled one day a few years ago. Delilah had only assumed it was because Ned was unstable, or maybe because he didn't want to risk getting caught with his son any longer. Whatever the reason, it motivates Henry to keep searching. Finding a set of keys assigned to the cave entrance to the north, Henry heads there to discover what is going on before the fire arrives. The two also learn that the girls who had disappeared had turned up down south, perfectly okay. They had been arrested for stealing a tractor. Firewatch has begun revealing its tricks. Using the keys found at Brian's fort, Henry enters the decrepit cave. Upon entering, the exit shuts, and so Henry treks through the cavern, his radio disconnected from the outside. Down he descends, all the while the player expects a grand realization. Perhaps a secret government facility, or aliens, or some horrible twist you can't even think of. It has to be at the end of this cave. It has to be.
Ah, shit. Oh, God. You're Brian Goodwin. You fell. Your stuff gave out. Poor fucking kid.
All you find is the body of a kid. There is no grand finale, no climax to which this conspiracy plays out. There was no conspiracy. You leave the cave and find an abandoned shelter. A cassette player is waiting for Henry, and when he hits play, it's Ned.
You can't blame me for keeping an eye on you. Not after bumping into you back in May. Down by the cave, for croc's sake. I've been up here for 3 years. I kept it cozy. Winters are harsh as hell. I ran out of books. But I got that antenna rigged up. And Delilah, she's a record you don't gotta flip. I kinda get why Brian took to her. About a week ago, I stopped worrying about you finding anything out, and that's right when everything went shithouse with you two.
All of this, the recording, the research station, the fire, all of it was just an elaborate trick played by a bored old hermit. The girls weren't related at all, and Delilah truly had no idea about any of this. All of it was a misperception of reality, caused by a man in the woods trying to hide something he couldn't forgive himself for. Just like the other two, Ned, too, couldn't face what he had done, so walked away from the cliff, accepting a solitude even Henry couldn't fathom. Ned serves as an example of what Henry could become if he stayed in the Shoshone, withering away, hiding his problems. When Henry arrives at the evac site, Delilah's watchtower, she's gone. Even after begging her to wait, she leaves. What Henry had done so long ago to his wife is, finally, done unto him. He's taken by helicopter out of the Shoshone and heads home. One can only hope he visited Julia.